All right.
So hi. To start off, would you like to just say your name and where you are?
I'm Gordon Wheeler, and I'm in Santa Cruz, California.
Perfect. So the first big question for you is, who are you? Who are you as a person? Who are you as a human being? And I mean, you can take that as values, passions, interests,
Mhm.
qualities, whatever you'd like.
Let me see. Who am I? I'm a father, a, what word would best express it? Healer sounds grandiose. Facilitator sounds vague. I, my life's work has been trying to help people. I'm a political being. That is, I don't just, my interest is not just in people one at a time, but in social movements, social equity. What are we at? 4. I'm a grandfather now to 10,
Wow.
a father or stepfather to 8. And so we have an enormous tribe. I'm a tribal sort of person. I've always lived that way in community. I'm a person pushing 80. That's very much part of my identity these days. I'm a meditator, uh, lots of tantric studies, lots of relational meditation. I'm a Southerner in the American US terms. That's a cultural marker. Uh, in this way, that I live now in an interracial family. I have uh, children and nieces and nephews who are biracial. And my family comes from a legacy of slave owning from before obviously before the Civil War, but on several sides of it. It's an all Southern family. So that's and I grew up in the Jim Crow South. That is the South that was very, almost an apartheid kind of regime. And so I'm still living through that transformation, but it's also been very much part of my consciousness all my life, that there are people that I can feel personally close to, but somehow as a class, they're um, expelled, they're different, they're held differently. So that's been part of my lifelong motivation to work with individuals and also with social movements.
Mm.
I expressed that work over the last 20 years through Esalen Institute, as well as in other venues. I'm a psychologist, and specifically a relational psychologist. I studied developmental and clinical psychology from a relational point of view before that was a thing. Before there was only like infant studies. There was attachment theory, but that only applied to like the first 12 months or something, they thought. And beyond that, there was no such thing as relational psychology, relational studies. But you could get at it through developmental psychology, through child and lifelong development. So that was my approach, and when we still didn't have a name for ourselves, and that's what drew me to Gestalt. I've done a lot of my work in Gestalt as a relational psychologist because it seemed to me as a young student in the 60s that neither the behavioral, nor as then it wasn't even quite cognitive behavioral yet, nor the psychodynamic Freudian legacies or their various derivations, Jungian and others. Neither of them offered any theoretical perspective that dealt really with a relational approach and perspective. They, in both of those paradigms, sort of large schools of theories, relationship was somehow something secondary and derivative to the primary drive. It was very much the individualist cultural paradigm, high mid-century, high modernism. Existentialism had very much an individualist bias. But developmentally and also experientially, that didn't make any sense to me. Whereas Gestalt seemed inherently a relational, contextual, contactful theory, but oddly enough, it wasn't being taught that way. It was being taught very much as part of mid-century, and for understandable reasons. This gets very discursive, but basically, Pearls and that whole generation of mid-century, very existentially inflected Gestaltists and other types of humanistic psychologists grew up in a world of mass fascisms of various stripes, communism, Nazism, all the different stripes. And in America, we had the soft emergent fascism of militarized consumerism, very conformist, the gray flannel suit and all that. In all of those regimes, relationship was something, it was a side effect of personal process. Or else it was something fascistic. That is, in fascistic movements, the individual is suppressed.
Right.
And it's the whole that matters. You see that most markedly in Heidegger. But in and in all the other different theorists and philosophers and psychologists that are fascistically marked. But the alternatives, it was very bipolar. If you were individualistic, then society and personal relationship were definitely of a second order. And if you were on the right wing, then the individual would disappear into the mass. And there was no sense, but in fact, life, not only human life, but life itself, it exists in the tension of those two poles. There's no such thing as an organism which is isolated from an environment. It would soon be dead in a matter of minutes, seconds really, when you think of breathing and all that kind of thing. And but nor is there an organism that doesn't have some impulse towards self-expression, even if you're talking about at a bacterial level. The bacteria that will follow a sugar gradient up, it will act in its own behalf in some way. Mm-hmm. So life is the tension between the separate and the all, the fused and the distinct. And so it seemed to me that self-process is a matter of inflections of those extremes. Like I can sit here and be one with everything around me, one with you. I can feel the ways, I mean, it changes my body state just to say those words. And I start to feel a different kind of vibration. Or
sorry, I was going to ask when these kinds of things start to become clear to you, when you start to understand how you think and how you move in the world.
Well, that statement about self theory and what is self, I probably would not have been able to make till like 1980. But I can see in retrospect that I was already wrestling with that. There was something wrong with all the regimes around me, as far as I could tell. They lost out the one, or they lost out the individual. The one in the sense of the cosmic, the all. And in the process, of course, in individual psychology, you also lost the spiritual domain. And the family that I grew up in, which was a liberal Southern, politically liberal, racially liberal, uh, so fiercely Enlightenment kind of thinking, and and fiercely anti-religious.
Okay.
So I must say, when I was like 16, and my father was quite a prude personally. He wanted to be a free thinker. He tried to be not like his Victorian parents, but he was actually very bashful kind of person. And I remember thinking, um, I could more easily talk to my father about masturbation than I could about my interest in religion. That would have been so much more shocking to him. If
So finding God would have been like your rebellion.
I thought of it as just something, it was an inherent part of me. I didn't feel it directed against him. I just didn't think I could share it with him. I didn't, I was worried about him. He had a heart condition. I didn't want to kill him.
No.
and, and that might
Okay.
have done it. Whereas talking about sex, he would have been violently embarrassed and would have soldiered on because he wanted to be a modern parent.
Nice. Okay. So another question that I do have is what comes to mind, sort of on the more personal side, is what comes to mind as an event or as a set of circumstances that you might want to say more about in your life that has really influenced you or shaped who you are?
Hmm. I know some of the things that have shaped me, and I have trouble remembering a specific event. It's more kind of a marker memory.
Mhm.
Is this dualistic relationship with Black people? And as a child, you were free to have relationships with. I was lived in a small city, so you weren't that far physically. It wasn't very segregated physically. Um, so you knew your family's maid. You knew her family. You knew her husband or her brother who was
And I'm
sometimes
assuming your
worked with.
family's maid would have been automatically Black.
It was just so redundant. I didn't even need to say it. In the
Okay.
Jim Crow South, I never knew anybody before I was an adult who had a domestic servant who was not Black.
Okay.
Even very, very rich people. It just didn't happen. Uh, So that's a kind of marker type of a memory that I can feel shaped me in ways that I spoke of before. Lots and lots of memories of my father, who was a very difficult person, but we were very close. Our closeness took a stormy uh, turn when I was an adolescent. We would have raging battles. And because he was politically liberal, it was hard to find something to disagree with him about. So we would argue about Fidel Castro, or so I'd find something radical enough to enable to be able to regard him as a hopelessly old-fashioned um, conservative fogey. And but lots of memories of traveling with him. He was a traveling salesman when I was young, and later on he became an executive in that company. But when I was little, I would go on long trips with him. This was in Texas, so the distances were immense. The trips would be long, sometimes as much as 2 weeks long, because you'd end up 1,000 miles away and you're still in the same state. And and so he liked to take me along, and I loved it. And as I got older, he would just take me out of school and for a week or something, and we'd go off on a trip together. We never talked. There was never any discussion of that. Like, obviously, you could, school couldn't be that hard. You could catch up. My teachers never said anything. And so lots of, but I was also learning the life events I associate with that type of memory are I've had a gift, a grace gift of having lots and lots of brothers in life, friends who were as close as brothers. I know I learned that from him. He was probably made too much of a brother of me, but he was a very good brother. And and the other thing I learned from him was um, I have had some kind of appeal over my long life to older men. That is, they were drawn to mentoring me, and I knew something about how to accept that. It's been a huge gift in my life. Probably a dozen important figures who have been important mentors to me and have taken a lot of interest in just helping me along in life. And so that's another memory that comes to me, sort of male relationships.
And that's actually another question that I have, is if there's any one of those in particular that you would like to speak a bit more about as a person who has influenced you. Or I know if you say there's 12 of them, it's difficult to
Yeah,
pick, but
yeah, that would exceed even the hour and a half. Certainly in our own Gestalt field, Edwin Nevis is such a person. Really took me under his wing and was very nurturing and promoting to me. Although he really didn't agree with me theoretically about a lot of things, but that was never a problem to Edwin. He didn't want he mentored lots of people, and he had no expectation that they would mirror him.
it wasn't a
Uh,
cloning process then.
Not at all. He was just like I dedicated one of my books to Edwin and Sonia Nevis, which is a well-known name in older Gestalt circles,
Hmm.
and they were among the founders of the Cleveland Institute. So trained thousands of people,
Hmm.
and then in later life they moved to Boston where I lived, so we became personally very close and mutual godparents and that kind of thing. But I dedicated a book to Sonia and Edwin Nevis, um, who have um, parented, I think I said, or mentored a generation of, uh, of Gestaltists and have had the ultimate, I'm paraphrasing, would have to pull it down to read it, but that they had the ultimate generative gift of nurturing their children and setting them free,
Mm.
which is the hardest thing for mentors, I think. I know it now as a mentor.
You're on the
But
other
I'm
side.
in that age, yeah. I don't think I'm in his league, but I'm in that age, certainly. I get looked to in that way. My most important mentor in life, I guess, after my own dad, but he died quite early, was my major's tutor. Well, this interacts with another way that the racial issue and those interracial memories are so important in my later life, which is that I've been very, very drawn all my life to Holocaust studies, post-Holocaust studies,
Mm.
and studying the Nazi movement, and I've written and edited in that field and translated in that field, and also I could see that was, people have often asked me, well, are you from a Jewish background? What's the connect? What's the tie-in? And what comes to my mind is growing up in the Jim Crow South. I knew apartheid racism at first hand, and in my body, I knew it and the wrongness of it. And
Hmm.
when I went to college, I thought, well, I thought I wanted to be, I don't know, it was kind of vague about it, but somehow in a healing profession, a doctor or a psychiatrist perhaps, or a psychologist, which is what it ended up being. But but I thought, but that means I have 4 years at my disposal for general education,
Right.
and uh, and so what I really wanted to do is understand evil. And after all, I mean, I was already 18, which is quite a mature level of age, as we know, and And
Huge.
so 4 years should be more than enough time for that. And then I don't really want to be a library scholar. I don't want to be a historian. So then I'll go on to my regular work, but with the advantage of having understood evil. So I
In
made,
4 years as an undergraduate.
yeah, absolutely, because largely, because really, and I went to a college that had a pretty liberal curriculum choices, so I could major in one thing and still take a lot of another thing. So I majored in, they had one of these combined honors departments called history and literature.
Hmm.
And, but you picked a period or a country to specialize in. So I picked modern Germany and specialized in understanding evil. Seemed like a good case study, you know.
Right.
A lot of evil happened, and how did that arise, and what supposedly was the most enlightened Western nation, and that kind of thing. And I did achieve a certain level of understanding. I understood, first of all, that evil is everywhere, and it's part of all of us. And secondly, that it's a part of us that's activated by fear. The way I would put it today is we have just as we live as humans in the tension between two poles, we have the capacity evolutionarily, it's been favored through our human evolution. We evolved as the most interpersonally, complexly relational of any species that we know of. And so we have this enormous capacity for sympathy and empathy and collaboration, which is really what enables humans to be an invasive species all over the world, because we're not limited. Our developmental environment is a human community, not some particular physical setting. So whereas chimps are endangered because they can only live in a very narrow echo band, which has been shrinking for several million years. Humans, we are endangered now, but only by ourselves. And we're endangered by the other pole of our nature, which is we're also, if we're predisposed to empathic personal relationship and cooperation, we're also predisposed to intergroup conflict. We grew up as human beings, evolving from other forms of apes. We grew up as this highly social ape by competing one group against another, which favors the intra-group cooperation, but easily triggered our default mode under stress is intergroup conflict, when the complexity is too great for the support in the environment. Well, the way we habitually are tempted to resolve that problem as humans, you could resolve it by increasing support so we can handle the complexity of modern life.
That would be nice of us.
That would be thoughtful. Why do we not do that? It's easy default, which is decrease the complexity of the field by placing an us-them boundary. That so vastly simplifies everything in the field. The only thing I need to know about you is which side of that boundary are you on?
Mm-hmm.
So if we're on the same side of the boundary, we have differences, but those will only emerge after the war is over. Temporarily, we'll get back to squabbling with each other. But, and if we're on opposite sides, well, I don't need to know anything about you personally at all, which is why fraternizing with the enemy is such a prohibited subversion, because you tend to get to know them, and it tends to activate your collaborative, empathic sides.
And it's interesting. I've been thinking, in the past 2 or 3 days, it's really been sitting with me, all of the different wars that I've been hearing people in these interviews surviving. All of the different cultures, all of the different time periods, all of the different wars that we've lived.
Yeah.
And what comes up in the interviews where war and conflict become present is usually sort of this attraction in Gestalt to the ability to deal with difference in a more tolerant and a more inclusive way.
Which requires more support at every level. And at every level, if you think of it in a Maslowian sense, you've got to have more basic economic, social support. You've got to have more emotional support and on up. And so if you want to promote group dominance and possibly intergroup within your society so that the rich can get richer and all like that, then increase the level of fear.
Mm-hmm.
People will their ability to think clearly will diminish. Their fail-safe to us them will increase. And then, of course, we know very well in the whole modern period, going back to 17th century, the best way to protect the status of the top group is to set the lower groups against each other. Could be religion, could be race. In this country, in the United States, it's typically been race.
Mm-hmm.
Often it's a combination. And then they expend their energy battling with each other, which we see today in contemporary United States and other countries. And they don't actually look at their common adversary who is oppressing them. So
I
anyway,
have a, sorry, go ahead.
well, I just wanted to say, going back to mentors, that it was my undergraduate tutor for 4 years, a magical man named Walter Grossman, who actually gave up a full professorship later on at Harvard, which he'd had for years, an endowed chair, to go be head of the library at the new urban campus of the University of Massachusetts in the 70s, after my time in school, when that was, these urban universities were being founded. There was a lot of money for that, to educate the less privileged classes. And he said he felt like he could sit at Harvard and do the same thing for the rest of his life, but if he wanted a challenge, he should take his capacities to this fledgling university. So he's the only person I've ever known who gave up an endowed chair at a Ivy League university, other than to go to another Ivy League university. So he's a very inspiring mentor for me. That's where I started on that jag about politics and race.
No, I mean, completely valid, because it's what the person brings into your life and what you take from the relationship, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So I am also curious as a person, and it's a fairly blunt question, but I mean, how do you understand your own privilege and your own identity as, a white man of a certain age, in the society that you live in? And what have you done with that?
Well, first of all, it's been the first half of my life, say up through my 30s, I would have thought I was free of prejudice, I mean, not free of all prejudice. I was prejudiced against certain, but racial prejudice. And in recent decades, all of us who are in privileged positions in society, by gender, by sexual orientation, by cisgender, and certainly by race, and different in different societies, but there's always privileged, we belong to various groups, each of us, and you can have a mix of privilege and disprivilege. But so what I've learned is that we harbor lots of unconscious biases. So that's one aspect of being in a privileged group, is that you have some work to do on that. I do, and I believe that all of us do. And then the other aspect of it is that it's an opportunity. You have more resources to try to, and more access and to privileged groups, and more resources to work with underprivileged groups. So to me, that always has carried a mandate to do nonprofit work and pro bono work and subsidized work. And for the last 20 years, I've been at a nonprofit institute, and I feel I kind of remain as involved as I do at that institute. I still work there now at Esalen. because, and I think I can say this is not bad-mouthing Esalen in any way. Esalen has always had an integral vision and curriculum and purpose in existing, which is to develop all aspects of the human potential, which would be the heart, the mind, the spirit, the body, and the social dimension. It's not it's not mind, body, heart, spirit to get rattled
Mhm.
off so easily. Um, Relationality, communal membership is just as irreducible a dimension of our humanity as those other four. So we insist on a five-pointed star, not just a list of four dimensions. So, but with that said, and Esalen has always had a political and social dimension to it, not partisan political, but geopolitical and ecological and all that. I still feel as we go through, like all institutions and nonprofits and other corporations are going through now, a whole kind of refocus for all the changes in society, that I need to stay involved so that the voice for social action programs at Esalen will be as loud as all the other voices, because it can tend to be an add-on at that type. Our clientele are mostly privileged, but we've done some really good steps in that direction. So at this age, I stay more involved than I love Esalen, but I probably wouldn't give it as much of my life as I do now, which is every minute is time taken away from spending with my grandchildren. Uh, and if it weren't for the fact that I feel like there won't be as many voices at the planning level, at the visioning level for social action. So that's still part of what I feel as part of a privileged group.
And that's another one. I think that's the last. Sorry, it's pouring rain here right now. I don't know if
Oh
that's
my goodness,
affecting my sound.
we don't know the
Um,
meaning of the word here in
well,
California.
I would love to send you some. I've heard, California's burning again.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, thunderstorms and everything here. So the question is about your age, how you are experiencing your age. And I noticed that comes up spontaneously for people after a certain point in life. But I've started to ask different people, even if they don't bring it up, how are you experiencing your age? And I'm just going to duck off camera for 1 second to close a window, but I am still listening.
Okay. Well, it's with me. I had an unusual aging curve to my life, which was at the end of my 50s. I had cancer, and it was misdiagnosed, and so it was this very metastasized stage 4 situation, and I had very drastic treatments for a year, and they didn't really expect them. They thought this would gain me something, but um, I've done better than they anticipated for
So
almost 20.
stage 4 cancer 20 years ago.
Yeah, 18 years ago. Yeah.
Wow.
And so I was in the hospital a week out of every month on round the clock um, infusions for chemo and all that for months. And at the end of that, I mean, I was 100 years old before I was 60. So then I started a curve of convalescence, which was like growing younger every year. And I was aware, particularly after 5 or 6 years of that, when I began to think that maybe I'll live long, that it wasn't quite so short a leash as they had told me I would be on. Still of indeterminate length, we don't know, but it is finite, but I don't know how long. But I thought, well, I have this convalescent curve where I feel more energy and more youthfulness every year, but there's some falling age ceiling, and those two curves are going to cross each other at some point. and then I'll start to catch up with my, you know. But I mean, I could not. I'm a marathoner. You know, I'm a runner. I do long distance running. I couldn't possibly have done that at 60 or 65. I started doing it in my late 60s. I was working up to it, but I mean, at 60, I couldn't walk from not. I'll forget around the block. I couldn't walk to the corner and back without sitting down to rest. So it was, you know. So that's all how I've experienced aging, and I would say the last couple of years, particularly since 75, I felt I could feel myself growing older. But before that, for the 17 years, well, for 16 years or something, uh, I felt younger every year. So it's been that's just kind of on the physical side. On the emotional side, I hope I felt more mature every year. A slow learner and a late bloomer, you know, so many ways. But on the spiritual side, I do feel younger and younger. I feel uh, a readier access to ecstatic being every year. So that's.
I was going to ask what spiritual youth would be like. I'm not.
Spiritual youth? Well,
well, I mean, you say spiritually you feel younger, so I'm not quite sure what that would be.
Huh. Well, I don't know. Maybe I've never said that before. In any case, no one's ever asked me that before. What does that?
Well, now we've just found your new article or your new book then.
Yeah. I think it has to do with access to ecstatic states. You know, we attribute that anyway to babies when they're well nurtured and mirrored and played with properly. Nobody gets that perfectly, but when you get it just pretty, babies are quite adaptable. Then I look at my grandchildren, and we just spend the whole afternoon laughing, you know, because that's the state they're in. If you just join them a little bit, then they just find themselves in the world so amusing. Of course, they're very privileged in having these very attentive parents, and I always thought, this is another way I've gotten younger and younger. I thought I didn't have that access as a child because my parents, who had many virtues, were not very attentive. They struggle a lot with depression and were wrapped up in that, and they self-medicated a lot. But they were kindly disposed. They never were mean. So, I mean, I grew up thinking, oh, I've had the worst childhood. Then I met a few other people. Found out I had one of the best childhoods.
Yeah, it's the difference between negligence and malignancy.
Exactly. And even when the malignancy is unconscious or unintended. But I don't remember anybody ever saying, within the family, ever saying a mean word to me. I felt out of place sometimes or unseen, but never intentionally discouraged. That's a huge gift, which I only came to appreciate when I opened my eyes and looked at the world around. But started working with people, you know, in clinics and that kind of thing. Then the horror of it. But what I discovered in recent years is that looking back, I always had that access. Originally in nature. I grew up on the edge of the wilderness in Austin, Texas, when that was a small, under 100,000 people. Literally, the wilderness started a couple blocks from there. Then there was just trackless wilderness, and I would half the afternoons of the week I'd be at, you know, this would be at 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I'd be out with my little friends, troops of boys, you know, just kind of tearing through you know, we had some ostensible game, but you kind of posit some game conditions, but then you're not really playing a game. You're just in it, being that role and all. But the other afternoons in the week, if there was no lesson or something like that, I would be out there by myself. And I couldn't have told you why or what I was looking for, but there was these moments of exaltation. I'd come around the corner and feel like I'm in a supercharged universe here. It would set, everything would be humming, and that access to that hum. I guess that's spiritual youth for me. I feel there's a hum of a background vibration in the universe. I'm not preaching that, that's my experience.
No,
And
no, and
when,
I'm just imagining the difference between childhood with nature and inner city childhood.
sure, sure, sure,
The
exactly.
cement does not vibrate like that.
Or even just middle class suburban childhood. This just was a uniquely wonderful spot,
Mhm.
a different kind of privilege of
Mhm.
vocation, and uh, and then um, as a young person, I accessed those states, sort of ecstatic being states, really through sex. That's the only place I knew to go after it intentionally. Until I learned something about meditation. And I thought, oh, this is why people meditate, because it's like sex. Well, duh. and, and
And you discovered Tantra.
well, sort of, yeah. And I did study that later on. But first, this was just un, unschooled experience. Uh, Way too unschooled because, as a guy in your 20s in that age, in the 60s, we knew nothing. Nothing. I mean, hopefully gay guys knew a little more. They at least had themselves and each other and could compare notes, but we knew nothing about females. Zero. It's
Oh.
really sad to think about. I don't know why any of them ever slept with us. Very misguided.
I
They should have slept with guys who were 35.
oh, okay. Well, we'll keep this on references. Tips
Yeah,
from the '60s from Gordon.
yeah.
So,
It's too late to be of use to anybody. Uh,
wow.
we live in a different age now.
So can
And
I switch tracks a little bit, or was there a thought you were going to finish there?
off of sex and ecstasy. Okay.
No, I wasn't on ecstasy. No, so the other, I mean, you've talked about sort of the shift of your interest through different areas of psychology, but I'm curious if there is a moment or a particular experience when you feel like you discovered Gestalt in this,
Oh yeah,
process.
definitely, definitely. When I was in graduate school at in Cambridge, Massachusetts, back in those days, this would have been still in the 60s. They started sponsoring some that they didn't offer anything about. Uh, the big thing then was tea groups and encounter groups, and uh, and they didn't offer that in any curriculum. Nor I was studying developmental psychology. They didn't offer it there, but they did have people that were coming in from places like Aslan and other places who had learned how to do these groups, and they had friends, were graduate students somewhere else, and they had friends so they would get sponsored for a weekend workshop that you'd pay $25 for or something. You'd come for 2 days and have these personal encounter type groups. And those people that taught those were trained in Gestalt. And and the first time I was in one of those groups, I actually thought uh, my life was ending because I began to connect with emotional states of grief that I'd never allowed. I'd been much too tight wound to ever touch. And and I went to all the pieces. And I remember thinking, I mean, I don't think I'd ever cried like that in my life. And someone just held me, and the group went on. And I just thought, well, eventually they'll get tired of this, and they'll just call the men in the white coats, and I'll be taken away, and that'll be my life. I mean, but there's nothing I can do about it. I no longer have any organized anything
Mhm.
beyond
A
having these thoughts.
breakdown.
I
Yeah.
was just completely broken. But of course, they did not call. They weren't phased. Maybe some people in the group were freaked out, but the leaders were not phased. And they, I don't know, after how long a time, it seemed like half a day at least to me. I don't know how long I sobbed, but um, as I sort of quieted down, which I didn't think would ever happen, I didn't know anything about a curve of arousal or anything. And I must say, I think this is a very long arc, but eventually I did spend myself in that way and began to, and kind of looked up, and nobody was seemed alarmed, and they were going about their group business. And gradually, eventually, at some point, I sat up, and I think I walked out of there a different person, and with the resolve that I had to learn something about this, whatever it was you called it. It was different from what we were getting in our grad school courses.
Hmm.
So that led me to some more extended sort of beginning trainings in with I think it was called the Boston Gestalt Center or something like that. They weren't really a center, but there were a couple of teachers that offered some weekend kind of training groups, and that led me then. Well, through that also I was studying in grad school. Um, I had the great good fortune of studying as a young man with direct students of Pearls and Goodman and direct students of Kurt Lewin,
Mhm.
or Levine, as for European listeners, who was the greatest of all the Gestaltists. Really, Gestalt therapy is a direct outgrowth of Lewin's action research model. Lewin is the only academic reference in Gestalt, in the book Gestalt Therapy. There are two footnoted references to Kurt Lewin's work in Gestalt. And he's the one that took Gestalt out of the lab, the psych lab, where they were studying people, with paper and pencil, studying subjects, to the world of situations. So he's the founder of group dynamics and industrial psychology, and as I said, action research, which is really Gestalt applied to systems. How do you study a system which is not available for dialogue? It will have a story about itself, but that won't be the real dynamics. How do you understand the dynamics? Lewin's answer was through you make an intervention and then see the effects, and then you'll begin to understand the real dynamics, not the professed uh, official dynamics of the corporation or the whatever organization or the family. And that is exactly Goodwin's experimental method. Do something, then see what the effect is. So whatever you do is an experiment, and it will have some effect, and then you begin to understand the structures, or we might better say habits, organizational habits of that organism, or that or that social organism. So so I studied with direct students of both of those Gestalt lineages, the the social and the therapeutic. The individual is therapeutic. Although Goodman, of course, bridged both of those worlds, but it doesn't come out as clearly in the theory. But
No, I noticed there for a minute. I kind of felt like I was getting this beautiful private class. I'm wondering when you started, like, when did it really just become a part of who you are and what you do?
well, through all that, I became involved with National Training Labs, which was doing group dynamics training, not officially called Gestalt, in Bethel, Maine. It grew out of Lewin's work. It was founded by Lewin in the 40s after the war. His initial explorations of group dynamics. So that was where all the kind of organizational consultants, early ones, were coming out of. And there I met a couple of teachers from Cleveland, and I thought, these guys I've got to see more of. They have a different way of carrying themselves. There was a man and a woman, and they took authority in the group in a different way that I didn't entirely understand, but I was enormously impressed by, and I had to learn more about. So that's when I went to Cleveland, which was already in '76, so several years, really most of my graduate school had passed. And that's when I began to see the world through a Gestalt lens, which is how I would hear your question.
Mm-hmm.
They used to, Gestalt Journal in America used to publish a directory before we had online, a directory of Gestaltists. It still exists online, and they would send you a questionnaire if you wanted to be listed in the directory. And one of the questions was, what percentage of your work do you do as a Gestaltist? And I looked at that question and I sort of turned it up. So I was like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? A set of empty chair techniques? What do you mean, what percentage? It's the lens I see through. That's how I understand through contact theory and figure and ground dynamics, figure formation, but also the hidden dynamics of ground. That's how I understand people, socials, whatever. I'm doing that every minute. I don't know what do you think I'm doing that 34% of the time? And I should put that in my little bio for people that are shopping for a 1/3 Gestalt therapist. I don't know, what would that even look like? But it was as if the question seemed to be, this is not to badmouth them, but this was all, 40 something years ago. The question seemed to be, that must seem to presuppose that Gestalt was a fixed set of techniques instead of a way of understanding human behavior and experience. Mm-hmm. Which, if you felt that was the most useful way, why would you not be doing it with certain clients? It doesn't make sense. Even I thought then that, of course, not all my clients know that I'm working in a Gestalt way.
Right.
They think I'm particularly good, as Gestalt therapists tend to be. Well, let me put it this way. In those days, in graduate school, we learned that relationship is an initial stage of therapy, pre-therapy. So first you establish a relationship, and then you're ready to start therapy. Well, that's enough said about that.
Yeah. Let me know when you get past the relationship phase, please.
Yeah, do that. Or when you get into it, if you're not doing it at all, maybe.
That's true. That's true. Okay. So I have another question for you, which would be what you identify as a particular challenge that you've either run up against or gone through in some way related to Gestalt, or you could talk about it more personally if you want to, but I'm kind of curious of what you've run up against in Gestalt.
I felt when I studied in Cleveland, and this was in the early and mid '70s, I felt that what they were embodying and teaching in their teachings, and exemplifying in their demos and all like that, the way they were teaching us to work was richer than the theory they were teaching us. Now, I'm not saying that everything wasn't there in the big book, Gestalt Therapy. Maybe if you read Goodman, you get pretty much everything somewhere. Although he may contradict himself a few times here and there about various key things. But he always, when he swings around, he comes back to land on the fact that we are social beings, and we have he would say that he wouldn't say the individual, he would say the embodied, the biological, the social, and the psychological, and that the person is all three of these all the time. But when they began to, their teaching was not reflecting all of that. So, and their writing didn't reflect all of that. And so that was an initial hurdle for me. I felt like we need to set the record straight. The Gestalt is much more than some people are being taught. Even though the taught curriculum is lagging behind the best practice.
Okay.
Is the way I guess I would put it. And so I wrote my doctoral thesis in that area and used case studies. And then out of that, I developed my first book. And I thought, nobody's going to like this. And worse than that, nobody's going to find it interesting. And instead, it seemed to create a little furor. And it made a bunch of people furious. And book burning was proposed, actually.
No such thing as bad publicity, right?
That's the way I felt. I felt, this is great. Now we get to get out and really dialogue this. Hopefully do more than debate it. Hopefully we'll really dialogue it. Where, in dialogue, I want to express myself, but I want most of all, I know myself, I want to understand your point of view. Mm-hmm. And hopefully you'll get to understand mine. And by you drawing me out, I'll understand my own better.
Right.
So, it takes two to know one, and it actually takes more than two, but anyway, several to know one. And that was not what most of the upset people were interested in. Huh. I found. There were exceptions though. But that was so gratifying. I didn't expect it to be picked up by a psychology book club and attacked and all like that. So
which one are we talking about? Which was the first
book? Gestalt Reconsidered.
Right.
And
the first of how many to this point?
Well, the ones I've actually written like all the way through is like 3, but I've edited and written the lead theory chapters for, I don't know, 6 or 7 more, and then I've contributed to other people's books. So I don't know the answer to that exactly.
Oh no, that's fine. Just kind of like
depends how you count.
Fair. So that was the challenge, is finding that.
The challenge to me was that there's a gap between the taught curriculum and the best practice. Mm-hmm. And I want to say something about that. Out of respect for my teachers and Gestalt, so that then after the beginning, it just became a really fun challenge, because I think, particularly developmentally in my own personal history, what I had to contend most with was feeling too alone, too unresponsive in an environment, so conflict, challenge didn't phase it. It was being ignored that I was worried.
It was
about.
Interest, right?
Yeah, and I had a not diehard, because he ultimately relented before he died, but a kind of designated opponent in New York, and I won't say his name, but he's a lovely person. But oh my God, he was one of these, like, these books must be burned. He wouldn't have said that, because he would have been against book burning. But otherwise, they should all be disposed of. And anything like Wheeler was just anathema. And but he turned, I forget, it was 75 or 80. And I went to New York and took him to lunch. And he was so surprised by the invitation. We had had a fond relationship before he ever read my first book. And I liked him very much, but he couldn't see me. And, but I didn't have anything against him. He kind of heckled me and made it hard to present at conferences because he would stand up and protest and say, this is all wrong. And I'd say,
Oh,
well,
wow. Like he literally would heckle your presentations.
Yeah, where other people there would have to say, could we please find out what the presentation is? And then we'll have a chance to debate it. Come on. And, but he couldn't contain himself. He was so upset. But that was okay with me. But I took him to lunch and he said, you know, I was surprised by your invitation because I used to think you were the devil. And I said, well, that's really interesting to me, Richard. You used to think that. But what changed? I'm really interested in how that shifted. And he said, oh, you know, perspectivalism. And, you know, you look at things from different angles and they have valid different,
Right.
Nietzsche's philosophy, basically. It was the greatest, along with Freud, Perl's greatest unsung source is Nietzsche. And I said, okay, but perspectivalism, isn't that what I've been saying all along? And he says, that would be a fair point. And then after that, we were best of friends again.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so I thought, okay.
Lovely. So one of the last questions that I have, and you know, I would love for this to be like the first of a couple of parts because I can tell there's a lot there. But one of the last questions that I ask in general is sort of where are you going now? You know, what is your current or next interest? Or what would you say is like the most sort of pointed, punctual next that you see for Gestalt?
Gestalt to me is everywhere. I mean, we're especially living and working so many years at Esalen. And my wife, Nancy, was the director of programs at Esalen for 30 years. Well, I was not that long a tenure. I've been president for about 20 years and I was CEO for almost 10. So we met everybody that came through. And the most interesting people in the world, both teachers and students, come through Esalen. Don't know if that's place is known to all your audience, but it's where Perls lived in the 60s and until, of course, he never could stay very long in one place until he found they were inadequate and they had a big falling out, left in a huff. But Gestalt persisted there, and it's been a very dominant theme at Esalen for 58 years now. We're celebrating our 58th anniversary. And so what I notice and Esalen always been committed to bringing the newest and whatever will develop us in a new way, bring that to Esalen and have a course there and make it into help people make it into a workshop. That was Nancy's work for all those decades. Creating co-creating with the teacher, thousands and thousands of workshops. In those days, there wasn't a teacher circuit till the last 15 years, say, where teachers would have their thing and then go from center to center. We still are looking for the new ones that are not, that have something new. Just because there are plenty of centers where the old ones are great, but you can get them. And so every new thing that would come down the road, I mean, one of their prime sources is Gestalt. I mean, what method of working with people today is not relational? what method is not working with the interplay of cognitive and emotional process? Whether it's EMDR or just all kinds of, and my contemporary trauma work. It's
You bet. I
all
was going to say field sensitive, trauma sensitive.
exactly. It's body centric. It's and talks about nervous system arousal. I mean, the whole modern model, the brain-mind model, that is being researched and validated all the time now in today's revolution, the past generation in cognitive neuroscience, is the Gestalt perceptual model, now elaborated into understanding of the brain. We didn't know anything that was inside the box then, but we only could infer these processes. I mean, that was how Gestalt started, trying to figure out how perception worked.
Mm-hmm.
And they found a lot of surprising things about it in the lab. And so it wasn't just armchair philosophy about, empirical philosophy or something, and phenomenology. So that's the future of Gestalt to me, is everywhere. And so I'm not so concerned about the boundaries. Or obviously, I've never been a purist about the methodologies of Gestalt.
Right. And so what's next for you personally?
Next for me is, well, as I said, I'm still working at Aslan. And we had this past week the 90th birthday of our founder, Michael Murphy, who is in full fettle. I mean, he is still our visionary leader. So I don't feel as old as I would if I didn't have Michael around. And he doesn't seem old at all, so how can I be old? But my current project really is something in cultural studies that has to do with the shift from the great mother religions to the war gods. A shift that took place over time, of course, but it's concretized in the whole mythology surrounding the Trojan War, which was the vanquishing. I mean, basically, Troy had to fall, according to the Olympian war gods, because they were followers of the old religion. And you can even see that in Homer if you look for it. It's a different culture, a more sophisticated culture than the Greeks, who are basically pirates. But they attacked this legendary city that has a level of civilization that they are not familiar with. But it also has riches, and they want to get it. But behind the story in Homer and in all the associated myths around that, the whole epic cycles that are lost, besides only the Iliad and the Odyssey are the ones we get. Behind that is this war between two families, two generations of gods. And the Iliad is the story of Achilles, who carries both lineages in his own breast and is torn between the two ethoses, the shame and glory and war ethic, or the ethic of care, and it's a much more feminized kind of regime. And he's constantly tempted between his dual fates. His prophecy is he'll have a short life and a glorious one, or a long, productive, happy life, but lived in obscurity. I mean, he'd be a king in a minor kingdom, but he wouldn't be legendary in myth.
Mm-hmm.
But legendary means you've built up stories that fit the war gods. Well, we're still wrestling with those two regimes today. In not only in gender studies, because you can't just reduce it to men and women, because there are men and women on both sides of those divides. But it's in politics everywhere, because the Iliad also marks the beginning of the nation state. It's not the temporal beginning exactly; it's a gradual thing, but the mythic cultural beginning. of the nation state as an ideal for its own sake. It's my country, right or wrong, my nation. And then the nation state is organized for war. It's organized like tribe against tribe. Potentially, you had periods of peace, but most of history is wars. And so now we're at the end of that regime, and we're either going to find something new, or we'll just destroy ourselves or the level of civilization we have marginally achieved and sink back to a different one through war, explicit war, or through the ecological crash, as we're experiencing now in California. And
I mean, this sounds like, it literally sounds like a completely epic interest that
it's
that
definitely
you're getting into.
in every sense of the word. But I feel like it combines my lifelong interest in gender studies and in studies of cultural domination and hegemonies and evil, going back to that theme.
And even coming back to, the genesis of the slave ownership and working in
exactly
a balance of society.
So that's the book I'm working on now. We'll see.
I'll look forward to that for sure. And I'll have to do a lot of reading to be able to keep up with the references. But
I don't think so.
I'll just grab a copy of the Odyssey and have that handy.
Yeah, that might help.
Yeah, I definitely need to keep up. But just a very simple ending on my part. But honestly, I really, really appreciate everything that you've been saying and your time and your generosity to get into this with me.
Well, I'll say to you what I said before when we worked together before, that I so appreciate you and your work and your way of being. So thank you. Like I said, my greatest fear is being left out. Thanks for including me.
Oh, no, not a chance. So thank you. And if it's okay with you, we will leave chapter 1 here. Does that sound good?
That's very tactful of you.
Okay. So